Hi everybody. As Paul mentioned, this is one of the areas that I believe has got quite a lot of potential to be a key part of the National Low-Level Waste Strategy. And I think it's one of the areas that, while some sites have sort of done a few projects and dabbled in it a little bit, I think you might agree there's probably quite a bit of scope for improvement and doing a bit more in that area. So I'll show you a few examples, a little bit about the strategic overview, how this sits with the national strategy, and some of the basis of information, the waste forecasts and things that we have available to us at the moment. So just to calibrate our thinking, what are we talking about? Well, we're talking about everything in the low-level waste category, right from the top end all the way down through low volume, low activity waste, down to VLLW category, and really right down to the borderline with exemption, and actually in some cases including exemption, because quite often within low-level waste, essentially you have exempt components of it. Low-level waste, very diverse range of materials. It can be metallic waste, it can be soft process equipment, PPE, etc. It can be soil, rubble from decommissioning, demolition. Diverse range of materials, diverse range of activities and levels of contamination. Diverse range of management options potentially available to us as well. The UK government policy, most of you hopefully will be familiar with this, was issued in March 2007. It very much emphasised the role of the waste management hierarchy, so where possible avoid, minimise, reuse and recycle in preference to disposal. It recognised that there was a shortage of disposal capacity across the UK and allowed a lot more flexibility in terms of considering those alternative waste routes. It also required NDA to develop a national strategy for the nuclear industry, and DEC have recently published their strategy for the non-nuclear industries. So the national strategy was developed over a 2-year period and then underwent about a year's worth of consultation with numerous different stakeholders. In order to develop that, there was a lot of stakeholder participation in that. We actually formed a national strategy working group, which consisted of led by NDA, but the repository basically acted in a coordinating way. But that group also included the waste producing sites, the regulators, and local stakeholders as well. So it was quite a diverse range of stakeholders fed into that. In terms of reuse, I've just extracted a few kind of choice paragraphs from the national strategy. I won't read all of it, but essentially what it does was it recognises, the national strategy recognises that there is an opportunity to reuse and recycle either low-level waste, very low-level waste, or exempt waste. But it also recognises that there are a lot of challenges in doing so. There are challenges around the regulatory aspects, there are challenges around finding people who will take the material at the time that it's being generated. So there's a clear timing issue there as well that needs to be considered. And also, if you're talking about low-level waste or VLLW and you're reusing that, then there are aspects around site end states as well, and the ability to delicense sites which have to be taken into account in making any decisions. The strategy recognised that some guidance was probably required, and NDA set forward some commitments to actually to help on this issue, and that was to essentially seek end users for soil and rubble and demolition products using UK networks. For example, the Low-Level Waste Strategy Group. There are other UK networks that hopefully we can tap into and work on. And also to provide examples, if you like, of good practice and how these opportunities might be implemented. And that's very much what we're doing today, I think. This is the first step of that. We haven't really done a lot of work on this in the last few years, I don't think, really. There's been a few projects ongoing, but we haven't really cracked the nut, I don't think, of reuse of soil and rubble. So I think this is a good first step, really, in kind of just bringing everybody, getting some information out there on what's been done in this industry, what's been done in other industries, and hopefully coming out of this, we'll see where we go forward from there. But I'm quite interested later on in the discussions to understand what NDA can do and what the repository can do as NDA's agent to support this process, because we have a national industry-wide remit. What can we actually do to make this happen, and what's missing at the moment? Why isn't it happening quite as widespread as it could be? So that's the challenge for today, is if you guys can tell me what we need to do. Reuse recycling is not a new concept. I really like this slide. This shows kind of where the conventional waste management industry was back in the year 2000 and how over the last 10 years they've gone from about 80% being disposed of to landfill down to only about 50% now, and the majority being reused or recycled. Some of that's metallic waste and bottles and tins and things like that, but a lot of it's aggregate as well. In terms of information, there's a lot of information on the inventory out there. We've done 2 reviews, one in 2009, one in 2011 that we published, and it dices and slices the inventory in many different ways. It also looks at what strategies sites are currently adopting, what kind of available UK assets and infrastructure are out there in order for us to manage low-level waste. When we look at what that actually means in terms of capacity for the repository, well, we do have quite a long-term capacity challenge. The inventory includes 4.4 million cubic metres of raw low-level waste, and if you were to package all of that to actually come to the repository, then the packaging volume actually increases quite substantially because of inefficiencies in the way the containers are designed and the ability to actually fill them to the brim. So essentially, if you say there's 6.4 million cubic metres of packaged waste and the capacity of the repository, its maximum theoretical capacity is 1.7 million, then potentially we've got a big problem. And the graph up there basically shows that if you basically send everything to the repository, then you'd be talking about filling up between 2020 and 2030, which is just a ridiculous timescale. So the national strategy really puts in place a kind of a framework, if you like, whereby the repository its life can be extended and we can manage it in a wise way, if you like, as a critical national resource. And in order to do that, and in order to actually we can actually manage the whole 100-year NDA decommissioning program and actually make the repository last to 2130, actually. But we have to recycle material, we have to apply volume reduction techniques such as, for example, metal treatment or combustible waste. And we also have to find alternative solutions for stuff at the bottom end of the activity range that doesn't require the level of engineered protection that the repository has. So that's your VLLW and your what I call low activity, low level waste. This is the sort of stuff about less than 200 becks per gram kind of level. If you just take the low level waste aspect of the inventory is divided into 2, low level waste and VLLW as it's currently categorised. Around about 45% of it is actually soil and rubble. So quite a lot of the low level waste inventory is this kind of material. Large proportion of low level waste as well as metal. So obviously there's a fairly big opportunity there to recycle that material and reduce the amount that has to be disposed quite considerably. If you then switch to very low level waste, which is about 3/4 of the inventory, about 3.3 million cubic metres of raw waste, well, 85% of that is soil and rubble. It's nearly 3 million cubic metres. So again, huge opportunity to either find an alternative disposal route for that or potentially reuse or recycle that material in some other way. And I mean, the inventory isn't, as anyone who's worked on the inventory will know, it's not a static thing. It moves all the time. Sites get better at forecasting their arisings. They mature over time. And this was some of the work that we did last year as part of the strategic review, where Magnux had actually gone through a process of reassessing their inventory. It was called the Smart Inventory process, where they went around all of their 10 sites and looked at the near-term waste arisings and actually led to them recategorising a lot of the waste that was there. The building was still there, but they took a more considered view on what kind of category, whether it was exempt or VLLW or low-level waste, and also what the opportunities for treatment might be within that. Sellafield did a similar review where they actually looked at some of these long-term arisings of VLLW that really take off around in the 2030s to 2040s. This is what they call broad front decommissioning, which is the kind of the knocking down of the Sellafield complex. And actually, when they really looked at, well, what waste streams made up that waste that was previously declared as VLLW, well, actually, they realised a lot of those buildings haven't actually been built yet. A lot of them are things like waste stores. And actually, if you build a waste store and you put waste inside it, and then you take the waste out of it, actually the structure itself will probably not be contaminated, actually, if the store is operated in the correct way, which of course it would be. David's smiling. Yeah. So actually, around about half of all of the VLLW actually would probably be exempt in the end. And again, this is all concrete and rubble things like that. So quite a big opportunity then when you really look into the inventory to do it. That's why we're very keen that we do, well, we find out what we have to do to make these projects happen. So what are we doing at the LLWR? Well, we've done a few things ourselves in terms of reuse and recycling of material. Most of it at the moment is clean material. This is Vault 8, and this is an aerial view of the site. This is Vault 8. This is this area here is the historic trenches, which are now covered over an interim cap. And this was taken in 2009, and it was where we were constructing Vault 9. That's all now complete, actually, but it's quite useful for illustrating what we actually did. To actually construct Vault 9, we actually dig out a large area of ground underneath the Vault 8 footprint, and we actually stockpiled a huge amount of material here. The perspective doesn't quite show it with the aerial shot, but there's about 500,000 cubic meters of soil stored there. And the plan for that is then actually that would then be reused as part of the capping profile. So assuming we move forward into cappings, currently planned around 2015, 2016 kind of time frame. That's subject to approval of the environmental safety case for the repository site by the Environment Agency, which is currently being assessed. But essentially we'll be building a big dome over this bottom end of the site to start the initial capping phase of Vault 8 and the trenches. And then the development plan for the site is to progressively move down the site as vaults are built and filled. The next vault would be there and so on, and we would progressively cap as we move down the site. But this mound of earth here could potentially be used as part of the profile, and that would mean that we wouldn't have to import that material into the site from somewhere else, so potentially big environmental saving. The other area that we're looking at as well is we're currently in the process of decommissioning some old storage magazines. These are a legacy from the early days as a Royal Ordnance factory, and in the 1960s someone decided that it would be a really good idea to send down some drummed and crated plutonium contaminated material and store it there in the nice moist wet conditions. And when we started a retrieval program in the, I think it was late 70s, early 80s, some of this waste wasn't in a great condition and had contaminated the internals of these concrete mounds. And so we had to build a facility on the front, as with the nuclear industry, you have to build a facility to actually take one down. So we built these magazine retrieval facilities on the front of that dock onto the magazine itself. And that acts as like an air change room and sort of decontamination area and size reduction packaging, etc., for the export of waste from the actual magazine itself. But we're actually undergoing the decommissioning and decontamination of the internals of those magazines now. All the bulk waste's gone. And we're hoping to get those down to the point where those structures will be essentially exempt. And when Vault 10 comes to construction, Vault 10 will occupy a footprint probably about there on the map. These will have to be knocked down, but there's a potential to actually use that material actually in the vault construction itself. So vaults require lots of concrete aggregate to construct them. So that's exempt material. Moving a little bit up the chain, we are actually actively considering right now the ability to use VLLW within the cap profile. So we've undertaken a feasibility study last year, and it actually showed that this area under the cap here, if you imagine that's the trenches and that's the vaults, and this is the finished closed site in conceptual terms. Under this profile layer here, you either have to use material that we have from the storage mound, which we don't have quite enough, or you would have to import clean material to put them there. So what we said was, well, why couldn't we actually put waste under there? So we've undertaken an initial feasibility study. We've just completed a business case, which actually shows that there is potentially quite a large cost benefit also from doing that, because you're avoiding sending that for disposal potentially. And during 2012, there's a bit more work. There's a work program basically which is going to continue to look at, well, what is the timing of arisings, the potential suitability of material, what is the impact of that on the environmental safety case, which is currently being assessed by the regulators. That's a critical part of the considerations. And also things like stakeholder considerations. What do the stakeholders think of with us using VLLW material in the cap profile? Have to take all of these things into consideration. So we're looking at an EA decision, hopefully on the environmental safety case around about 2013, and then shortly after the cap, that enables the cap to be constructed over Vault 8. But we are looking at whether or not actually to meet any near-term arisings, we could actually commence stockpiling a bit earlier, because one of the assets we have at the LLW Waste Repository is actually land, believe it or not. There's only about half the site actually ultimately will be developed. So there's quite a lot of wide open space area which could potentially be used to do a bit of stockpiling, or we could use the vaults themselves actually potentially. So anyway, there's quite a bit more work to be done on this, but it actually has quite a big impact because you know, you can basically accommodate around about 200,000 to 700,000 cubic meters of VLLW over the next 80 years. So it can make quite a big contribution, if you like, to the reuse and recycle of the material that's going to be generated during that phase. So going forward, I thought I'd just mention the national programme a little bit. Essentially, what the national programme is, it's a relatively new thing that's been developing over the last year. Essentially, it sets out how the nation is going to implement the low-level waste strategy. And in terms of making it simple, it's a big schedule with all of the activities being undertaken by all of the waste-producing sites across the UK in it. It's broken by a certain work breakdown structure, and it also allows us to track waste metrics as well. So one of the things that we've struggled with over the last few years is actually being able to really understand whether the strategy is being implemented and how effectively it's being implemented. So what we're trying to do is put in place a mechanism by which we can report waste metrics, and we can then display those in a way so that stakeholders, government, NDA can actually understand the progress we're making and actually what that means. For example, how many years of life extension does it gain for the repository if we recycle 1,000 tonnes of metal? You know, it's questions like that that we need to be able to answer. So that's currently being rolled out, the national programme, and is looking to go live this month. And the key thing really is it allows better coordination between the sites. So the site A can see that site B is working on an activity, whether that be generating waste, for example, suitable material for reuse, or whether it just be a study into exemption orders or something like that. And the sites can then coordinate their activities a lot better. We as a repository and as a service provider for things like metallic waste or combustible or for very low level waste, we can actually see what they're doing. They can see when we're bringing certain things online, and you know, we can work together in a more efficient way. So just to wrap up, I guess you know, the key messages are there are large volumes of low activity concrete and soil will be generated over the next century. Reuse and recycling is a key area of low level waste strategy. It presents us with a big potentially economic and environmental opportunity to do things better. And it's an area that we haven't really, I don't think, in fairness, developed to its full potential yet. So I'm interested to hear this afternoon how people think that, that can actually be done. The LLWR is looking at its own reuse in the cap opportunity from 2012 onwards, and the national programme, which will be increasingly you'll hear more about. We hope to have the schedule published some point this month, which will basically, you'll be able to look and see who's doing what and when in areas like this, and potentially coordinate your activities. You can see when you might be able, there might be the supply chain can then step in and interface with those activities as well. So.
Thank you very much.